Hello and welcome to another AdvancedSkeleton video. In this video, we are gonna take a look at rigging of Sam. Now this character has been modeled by Marat Latypov, and there's a link in the description below where you can go and take a closer look at more of Marat's wonderful artwork. So this video we're going to look at how this character was rigged, but first I'd like to show you how you can get this character. If you have AdvancedSkeleton already installed, it's fairly easy. You open the demo section here and you choose Sam. If he's not in the list, you might need to run a update. You check online for updates and they'll be highlighting here that you can download any updates. So you choose Sam and hit open. That will open the rig. If you do not have AdvancedSkeleton installed, you still want to get hold of this rig, you can download it directly from the Animation Studios website. Go to the downloads section and there's a section here called example rigs, and Sam is currently listed right at the top here. So this rig, one of the first things you might notice is that he has a fair amount of these yellow small controllers all around on his body. These are corrective controls, meaning they are added custom controllers that are automatically driven to do corrections. And what we're correcting for is the deformation. So we can quickly test by selecting the elbow control and rotate it, and we can see that these small yellow controllers are automatically moving as we are adjusting the main controllers. So we will be taking a look at how this is set up as part of the rigging process. So let's start from the beginning where we just have a model. Now what we can do in this case, we can actually extract just the model from this rig file. So we'll go in and find that there is the model under geometry. Now you might notice that it has a namespace. That's because the model was referenced in when the rigging was done. However, that is no longer a live reference. So what we can do, we can just unparent the model. We'll rename it so it no longer have the namespace. Then we'll remove the rig, which we can start out by just hitting toggle fit advanced and then delete advanced. That'll delete the advanced rig, which leaves us just with the fit skeleton. We'll delete that as well. So at this point we have just a model. Now we are going to run the model cleaner tool, and this is something that's highly recommended that everybody run on their models. Now it is quite a common pitfall that many choose not to run the model cleaner and just manually clean by doing little tricks like freeze transformation, make sure that the attributes are at 0 and that there's no obvious history notes showing in the channel box. This is often not enough to clean the model. There can be many nodes in Maya scenes that are not easily seen just by looking at the outliner. You can turn off DAG objects only filter and you can get a glimpse into some of the additional nodes. You can see here we have a lot of extra nodes that we didn't see by default. Another thing is that you don't always see the multiple shape nodes that can come with the character. An example of this, if you pick your geometry, you hit the down key on the keyboard and then you can pick walk sideways. You can see here we have 2 shapes, and that's just another thing that makes this model not in a clean state. And yet another thing is that even though your channel box might show default transformation values, there could easily be other things such as offset pivots and shearing values that are going to give us undesired effects in the rigging. Long story short, instead of manually cleaning, it's highly recommended that you use the model cleaner tool. So let's go ahead and hit the clean button. You can see that Maya then generates a new scene and brings the geometry in. Also, it brings the geometry in non-smoothed. And this is another thing that's highly recommended. And that's that you do all your rigging in non-smoothed mode. Now the smoothing you can do with the hotkeys, 1, 2, 3 on the keyboard. And you probably know that hitting the 3 on the keyboard gives the model a more nice, smooth look in the viewport. but it's not recommended to have this on in the rigging process. You can turn it on from time to time to get a preview of what the end result's going to look like, but for the most part, you're going to be better off leaving it at the setting 1, non-smooth it, for your rigging process. So far we got the model cleaned out. And what I will do at this point to demonstrate the recommendation of referencing in a model, I will save this out as a new file. So I'm going to go to the desktop. I'm going to make myself a folder for the character. I'm calling the folder Sam. A subfolder, that's going to be the model. I'll give it the short name mod. I'll also make a new folder in here that's going to hold the rig. Call that rig. In the model, I'm just going to call this file Sam, MA. Now that that's saved, I again make a new scene. Actually, what we can do is open this preparation rig section, and that suggests to us make new scene and reference in the model. We're going to reference in the sam.mb from the model. When we do that, you can see that that automatically has assigned it on a layer called high. And we're ready to start. Then the next thing is going to be to bring in a fit skeleton template. For this guy, we're going to go with the default biped template. So let's go ahead and import that. Now for the positioning of the joints, I'd like to start out with obviously the root. Well, the very first thing is probably a good idea to select the top node here and make sure you got the overall scaling. This guy's actually roughly in the right scale already, but if not, you want to scale this to roughly the correct size. Then it's the positioning of the root, which I find is to be done in the side view. Then we're going to work our way down with the legs. Now you'll note that this character is in a pose as opposed to a T pose. Now in general, the recommendation is to have characters in the T pose, but if you do have a model in A pose that you need to work with, then that's fully possible as well. In one of the frequently asked questions videos, there's more in-depth information about A pose versus T pose, and there should be a link on the screen right now that will take you directly to that section of that video if you want more details about A pose versus T pose. Then for the leg, what I'll do, I'll go to the front view. I'm gonna give this roughly the right orientation to start with, so we can see it's actually pointing a bit outwards. Next, I'm gonna place that knee joint. Now, the way I would prefer to work is to select that knee joint and just slide the translate X to line up with the knee. If we needed to move, I would go to the hip and rotate it. Now, that's not a necessary workflow. You can freely move this around if you want. In the end, the rig will need to have a clean translate on one only axis, but this can be taken care of automatically when you build the rig, or you can at any time do the update that takes care of the auto orientations. And that's going to be the update now button. So we can see with this knee selected currently, because I just used the translate tool, we got translate on 3 axis. As soon as I hit the update now button, you can see that's been reoriented to make sure it's only on 1 axis. Then next for the ankle. So in this case, I'm going to want the ankle just a little bit further this way. Now, one way would be just to move this joint, but that will create a kink in the knee at that point. So the way I would prefer to do this is to get the ankle moved over. I would just rotate the hip a bit sideways. And again, this ankle should be more over here. You're free to just move it, hit update now. My preference would be to select the knee and rotate it until the ankle is in a better position. Now there's a few different options in the edit subsection here that can help us improve our fitting here. And one of them is we can turn on joint axis. And we're seeing immediately that the way the joint axis works, it's aligning the axis to aim down the bone. for most joints. And in X, you can swap out on the auto orient subsection here. You can swap out which axis is being auto aimed. However, the general recommendation is to keep the default, which is X down the bone. And then you can see there are some special cases, like the ankle joint here does not follow the general rule of having its X aiming down to its child. And that's because it's going to make more sense from an animation point to have this world oriented. So it has an axis that lets you twist in this direction. And that's one of the attributes you can see when you select the ankle. You'll see over here it has an attribute added, world orient, and the option is for X to be pointing straight down. This is one of many fit attributes that can be added. Here's the whole list, and here's the explanations what each one of them does. But yeah, we can see that in this case, if we were to do something like rotating this, it no longer has its X-oriented world down as the fit attribute says. Again, just hitting the update now button is what's gonna make sure that the auto orient rules are being applied. Fit mode is a special mode. You get a heads up display indication here that you're in fit mode. When you're in fit mode, any change you do automatically triggers an update. So as soon as anything get moved or rotated, it will run the update to make sure the auto orient rules are being followed. So it's an option to be working in fit mode. My preference is to have that off, and I'll just manually be hitting the update now button when I want to execute the function. Now in this case, I'm going to use the clipping plane to my advantage to get a better view of this. So the top view here, if you select the camera is just another object. You can see how high it is in the scene at 1,000 units. I'll bring that right down to 0 and then lift it up a little bit. You can see that the clipping plane is now just above the ankle. That just gives us a good view to see the orientation of this foot, and I can see that this would be better oriented to roughly be the direction that the foot is pointing. So the toes joint here, we're gonna want to place, like most other joints, roughly in the middle of the mass. So the deformation starts in the center here. But when it comes to the next joint now, toes end. Now this joint, placement of this is going to be a bit different than most other joints, because in this case it's an end joint, and its position, it's not going to determine the effect of the deformation, but it's going to determine the effect of the motion system. So we're going to get a controller at the location of this joint, and it's going to be able to rotate the whole foot around it. So it's the IK toes controller. So instead of placing this in the center of mass out here, this should be placed right down on the ground plane and then pushed into where you'd like the pivot to be. So right down on the ground plane, right about here. Likewise, these two joints sticking out on the side here, these are indicating where the pivot points are going to be for the foot rocker system that allows the foot to tip from side to side. So again, we want to drop this right down to the ground plane and move them to about where the edge of the geometry is. Put the inside here and the outside. Likewise, the heel, we want to make sure this gets dropped down to the ground plane, right about as far as the geometry goes here. Okay, that's it for the leg. Let's move on to the spine joints. By default, the biped fit skeleton does not have many spine joints. It's basically just got the root and then one spine joint here called spine 1 until we get to the chest. Now the reason for that is because it's using the in-between joints system, which is, you can see here we have the fit attribute, and if you wanted to know more about it, you can select in-between here. You get a quick tip here, it creates extra in-between joints, and a little bit more information by opening the help image. And it says here in between, it will build joints in between fit skeleton joints where the FK controller's rotation will be distributed throughout the joints. So, and current settings is for 2 for each of these. So each one of these are going to get 2. So that means this default spine setup is going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spine joints. But instead of having the 7 individual FK controllers, you'll just have the 2, and it will automatically distribute the rotation from those controllers onto those 7 joints. Likewise, the IK system will interpolate the resulting joint chain and distribute it throughout the joints. So what I prefer to do is, firstly, I want to make sure I have the chest joint at the position that I'd like the chest to rotate around. So for this guy, I'm going to put it right around here. And then next I move the spine joint. I hit insert on the keyboard, allowing me to freely move this around without the children following. And I roughly place that halfway between the top and the bottom. Now, if you prefer not to be using the in-between joint system, you rather set the exact number of spine joints and get a controller for each. That's fairly easy to do that. You just select these 2 joints, make sure in-between is selected in the drop-down menu, hit remove. Now it's not going to build those in-between joints. Then the next thing is you select the chest, root, and resample. That's a button here. There we go, resample. And it's detected that by default, between these, it's a total of 3 joints. You set whatever you want. Say you want 20, something like 25 spine joints. You hit resample. And there we go. You got 25 spine joints. That's going to have a controller for each. So that's just showing that how that would be done. I'm not going to use that in this case. I'm just undoing a couple of steps back. Next is going to be the scapular joint. And again, I'd like to use the clipping plane on this top view here to get a closer view of what's going to be a good position for the joints. So I'll move it down. I'll have the camera sitting just above the area that I'm interested in here, and in the attribute editor, selecting the file clipping plane, give it a low value, and then hold down the control key. It allows me to slide the value up and down. So I might do something like that. That'll just kind of give me a nice little intersection view of the whole scapular shoulder area. And I can see that I would be well served with moving a little bit backwards. And then I simply slide out in the axis this shoulder joint. Okay, and then likewise here, instead of just picking this elbow joint and moving each one down, I'm gonna at this point just apply that rotation that I know is gonna be needed. Now another function that's available here that can help us with this placement is the visualization of geometry. So under display here, we can turn on the checkbox that says geometry. We can choose from different types. We got cylinders, boxes, spheres. We even have some skeletal bones that could be helpful for the placement. I'm gonna go with cylinders here. We can also adjust the gap that's gonna be between each of the bones. And what you can see here is that you get a representative gap of what's gonna be each partial joint. So for the forearm, if we turn off geometry, you can see the entire forearm is just that one bone. Same with the lower arm. But it has, again, it has a fit attribute. In this case, it has that fit attribute called twist joints. And it's got its number set to 2. So that's going to be producing 2 joints in between here. That's going to be distributing twist. And that is representative in the fit geometry. So when you turn this on, you can see that you actually have that. Same with the spine joint that we said before. It's, even though there's just 2 fit joints, the actual deformation joints are going to be about 7. And you can see it here. Now here's another thing that's quite useful when you're turning on the geometry. And that is that you can control this parameter called fat. And that essentially adjusts the size or fatness of these geometry representations. Now, it's recommended to go over your character and actually make sure that these are roughly correct so that they kind of match the geometry. Now, this fat parameter does not only affect this visualization tool for the fitting, it will also affect a few other things down the line. For example, the size of the controllers that gets built. The default size of the controllers are going to be based upon this fat parameter. Also other things later on, like you creating SkinCage and other functions, is going to read the fat parameter from each fit bone to use as a default starting point for size. So it does make things better when you have gone over your rig and made sure that these are roughly a reasonable size for your geometry. Alright, as we're coming down to the wrist here, and we're gonna move on to the fingers. Now the fingers gets a little bit tricky to position when the character is in a pose like this. When it's in a straight T pose, everything's aligned with the world plane, so it gets easier to position. Now to help with this, there's a few different things and tricks that can be done. One of the things I like to do is create a new orthographic camera, then move and orient the camera so that it aligns with the hand. And you can see then we get a view where the hand and fingers are more straight, making it easier to place the joints. And after placing the first one, I just use the up and down key on the keyboard to quickly jump between finger joint number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now there is a joint right here. Now that's called a cup joint. Essentially, it's a simplified hack to simulate metacarpal joints without having each of the metacarpal joints. And the idea is that instead of the full set of 4 or 5 metacarpal joints, the main motion that these provide is the ability to cup up the hand. And that can be achieved with simply just one joint. So it's a compromise simplification. Now this is not a required simplification. Now it just happened to be used on the biped fit skeleton template. If you wanted to swap it out for a full set of metacarpals, you're free to do so. You can manually just delete this joint and place the metacarpals, or you can do it automatically by selecting in the extra limbs section. You select hand, and if you import that, that's going to swap out the simplified hand with the full set of metacarpals hand. But since we have the default simplified here, we are going to keep the pivot point here close to the wrist. And we're going to see later when the rig is built that that's going to give us the ability to cup the hand without the full set of metacarpals. Okay, let's say we're happy with the hand at this point. We'll jump over to the side view and see what we got next. And that's going to be the neck and head. The neck, we're going to be placing it around here, and the head right about here. All right. So that'll be it for the fitting. It's time to run build advanced skeleton. And there we go, we got our rig, and we can see that the size of the controllers are already fairly reasonable, and that's because it's determined those sizes from the fatness of those fit geometries. So the next thing I recommend doing is just to look over the controllers and make tweaks where needed. For example, the chest controller here, you can see although the scale is fairly reasonable, it's not ideal that it's kind of cutting in and out of the geometry. So I would scale this one up a little bit. Quick way to do that is select the controller and select all the, go to component mode, select all the points, and just scale this guy up a bit. Likewise, we might want to scale this one down a little bit and just go over some of these controllers and make sure they're more neatly aligned. So in the case of the neck here, we might want to scale it down a bit. That goes through the neck, so we could just move it up a bit as well. Now by default, the character will come in with the FK arms and IK legs, which means we're not seeing the opposite, which would be IK arms and FK legs. So just to see those and to see if we need to tweak the controllers, we can just select the FK IK blue cross and change the value from 0 to 10. That will show us the IK. And we can see here in this case we want to scale that IK controller down a bit. Now in some cases, like here, if you select the controller and you jump to component mode, it's going to include the component for the child controllers as well, which in this case we have an additional IK controller here because actually we use the IK local option, so we have an additional local IK controller here. So instead of just going to component mode, because that's going to pick the points for both controllers, instead I select the controller, I hit the down key on the keyboard, which takes us to the shape node, and at that point I go to component mode. Now we get only the points for this controller. Now we should not forget that there is a other side to the controller. We've only worked on the one side. We want to make sure the other side has the same controller size and shape. That can be done with a button in the subsection here called control curves. And the first button is the mirroring, and we want to mirror right to left. There you go. I'll undo redo. You can see that indeed that has been mirrored across. Yes, the legs are in IK, so I'm changing that value from 10 to 1 so I can see the FK leg controllers, and I see that I do wish to tweak this a little bit to make them look even more nicely aligned with the geometry. And again, making sure that's mirror across with that mirror right to left button. Now we have several other options in here where we can quickly take a look at that. Then we got scale as a function here, and that's something you could do if you wanted, say, this controller to be only half the scale. I can set that to 0.5 and hit the scale button. That will give it half the scale. Hit it again, it's gonna go 50% again. If that works on selected controller, now if nothing is selected, it's gonna go on all controllers. So if you wanted all controllers to be maybe twice the size, I would just set the number to 2, make sure no controller is selected, and hit scale. That's gonna double the size of all the controllers. I'll undo that for now. Swap curve is the next little button here that allows you to basically make any curve on your own. You could, for example, start with a circle, make any kind of interesting shape by scaling some of the points. We can maybe something like this. So if you wanted one of the controllers to have this particular shape, and before we do it, let's give it a unique color as well. If we want one of these controllers, say the FK ankle here, to be having this control curve shape and color, we would just select the ankle and shift select our custom made curve and hit swap curve. That swapped out the curve. Now it also works if you select multiple, say we select all these FK controllers, and lastly shift select the custom one and hit swap curve. That's swapping out all those controllers with the customized one. Now another hidden little feature that you can do here, if we go to build pose, swap curve works with edge loops. So if, for example, let's turn on wireframe and shaded. If, for example, we wanted this controller on the thumb here to take on the shape from the geometry, we could just go to the edge, double click on this edge, and we're going to also want to select the controller. So it can be a bit tricky to select both components and objects at the same time. So what we'll do, select the controller first, use the outliner, we hit F, that shows us where it is in the outliner. Then we double click on this edge that has the edge selected, hold down control key, click on the controller in the outliner and hit swap curve. What's happened now, you can see it's taken on the exact shape of that edge loop and applied it as the control curve. So that's a funky little function that'll just allow you to make some interesting control curves that'll be exactly matching the geometry. Also, there's a little color picker here. Let's you quickly set the colors. Then you might notice when we first opened the finished rig of Sam that the color scheme was not the same that you're seeing here. The default AdvancedSkeleton's color scheme is coming in with all FK controllers are this light blue color, and then IK is the red color. Now there's other ways of color coding controllers. Another one is that you could color code left and right. So let's go ahead and do that. Say we want our right side to be red. We make sure all FK controllers on the right side are red. FK right. So we pick the color red, we choose FK and we choose right and hit set color. And now the FK left, we'll just keep them blue and maybe we'll take the middle ones yellow. So choose yellow, side, middle, set color. So you can see now we're changing the scheme over a bit. So let's also do the IK red on the right. We get red IK controls on the right, and for the left we're gonna swap that IK left to, let's go with the dark blue. Next, let's go ahead and get this model attached to the rig. Now we can see, if we follow the steps of the build here, that we have deform, and there's option 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there's various options here for attaching to the rig, and in fact none of them are actually required or needed. You can do it using any deformer type you wish. Just be aware how the top level AdvancedSkeleton structure is set up. If you open the outliner, you see this top level called group. If we open that, we can see a separation between motion system and deformation system. So if you want any kind of custom deformation, you just want to make sure that you are attaching to these joints that are under deformation system. These are the binding joints. All the rest is gonna be now the motion system is all the controllers and the behaviors, and deformation systems are binding joints. So let's look at the option 1. This is the simplest one. It says just select the object you want to deform, hit the button that says plus select the deform joints. That means it will select in addition to the deform joints, and pop open the bind skin options. So in here you can bind with any options that you wish. Now there are some cool options here, that is heat map and geodesic voxels. We can go ahead and test this. Let's hit apply and close. Now these options do help with some of the typical issues, separation between arms and fingers. So we can get some decent results just using my default bind with some of those options on. But we won't get it quite right on the first go. These are typical kind of issues where geometry gets really close to other geometry. It doesn't quite know how to deform that nicely. So the simplest way to get started would be to use this option and to start painting weights to improve on the deformation. But for our Sam character here, we are gonna use option 2, SkinCage. So let's go ahead and create the SkinCage. And the SkinCage essentially is a very low poly representation of the character. You can see that it has essentially a box shape where there's edge loop that's going to be right where each of the joint is going to be. And that SkinCage is already skin bound because it knows where each joint is. So what we can do then is we just select the geometry and we hit the copy weights function. Now that has now applied skinning to the character, and the weighting has been taken from this SkinCage. So that's right away gonna give us better results than the default binding methods. And it also has some other benefits, like we can now adjust the weights, but we'll do it by moving points on the model. So you can kind of think of this as weighting by modeling. Now let's take a closer look what we mean with that. For example, we'll hide the skin cage. We'll look at how the elbow bends. If, for example, you wanted this bend to be much more broad, a much less sharp bend, then the way we would do that is to go and look at the skin cage. Now when we look at the skin cage and we adjust the controller, we can easily see how and why we are getting the deformation that we are, because each point on the model is weighted to each joint. So we can see that if we move these points, slide them upwards, and likewise let's slide these guys downwards, and if we now rotate the elbow, you can see we're getting a much broader area of deformation on this skin cage. Then if you wanted that on our character, just select our character again and hit copy weights, and you can see that we have now increased the area of the deformation. So working with a skin cage is quite a handy way to be able to sculpt the way you want the deformations to be. Let's go ahead and do some adjustments. For example, here around the shoulders, let's go ahead and bring these guys right up, and you can see that in general the green curves are representative of exactly where the joint is sitting, and it's going to rotate with the joint 100%. And then each green curve is going to have red curves on either side of it. So for this guy, it's going to have one up here. That's going to determine where the deformation starts, and this is going to determine where the deformation ends, or in this case where it's twist joints, is going to be where that twist joint is sitting. And as we're doing changes on one side, we're going to want that across on the other side, so we want to make sure to be using the mirror function to keep it symmetrical. Now a thing to keep in mind is that when you make an adjustment to the cage and you then select the geometry and hit copy weights, it is replacing all your current weight on this model with the weighting from the cage. So you got to keep that in mind, so you don't accidentally go in here, select the model directly and start doing some fine tuning of weights, either by painting or just entering numbers in the component editor. If you do that and then you go back and use the copy weight functions, you are losing that detail. So you want to keep track of what stage you're at. In the beginning stage, you want to do all your weight tweaks by this modeling, the skin cage. Then as you want to go into finer detail, you don't use the skin cage anymore, you just tweak it. Let's say you have fine-tuned the shoulder area here exactly by painting weights, but you wish that you did have some changes to the skin cage. For example, these were moved to give a broader deformation of the elbow. There is a way to get that copied across without losing the manual weighting from the shoulder, and the way is you can select parts of the model. In this case, what we could do is select the vertices around the area where we know we have made some changes to the skin cage, and with that selected, we hit the copy weights button. Now only that area will inherit the weights from the cage, leaving all other areas, such as the one we had fine-tuned here, as they were from before. Eventually, when you're happy with your weighting, I recommend removing the skin cage, not leaving it in the rig, going down the pipeline all the way into animation, because this is useless to animators. At that point, that's just going to make the rig slower without having any functionalities. So when it's finished serving its purpose, helping you with the weighting, you do want to make sure you hit delete and remove the skin cage. So let's move on to what we mentioned in the very beginning, that this character is going to use a lot of those corrective controls to help with the deformation. Now, corrective controls, what are they and why use them. So when we say corrective controls in AdvancedSkeleton, it's not a particular section or function here called corrective controls, but rather we're calling corrective controls a combination of the other functions. So the controls that we usually refer to with corrective controls are going to be custom controls, which are found here, custom controllers. And they are created by first creating soft mods to define the area, and then from that we're going to create a control. So we're going to get these custom controllers. On top of that, we are going to make sure those custom controllers are driven to have certain behaviors, and that's going to be done with driving systems. And the driving system is going to be using automatic drivers. So by looking at other values on other joints, it's going to be driving it. So driving systems, driving custom controllers. By the way, don't confuse corrective controls with corrective shapes. There is a function and a section called corrective shapes where you can go to any kind of deforming area and sculpt the corrections that you want. But we're not going to use corrective shapes for this character. We're going to use corrective controls. And when we say corrective, what we are correcting for is we're correcting for the deformations not being great, which is typical when you're using skin binding. Let's have a look at trying to be correcting for the deformation result we're getting when we're bending this elbow. You can see by default we are losing a lot of volume in here. That's kind of shrinking up. So that's one of the first things we want to correct for, is that volume. We don't want this to be shrinking up. So in here we'll go into the custom controller section, and we create these skin controllers by starting off with a soft mod. So let's do that. Let's put one right here in the elbow. Actually, what we can do is we can go straight into a pose that we want to correct. So in here, say this is the elbow, it's lost a lot of volume. We create a soft mod right on the elbow tip, and we start pulling this out. So you can see that's going to be more of what kind of result we're after. We might want to increase the area here, which we can do by just clicking on the manipulator and start increasing the area. So now you can see that this is going to start looking more interesting than the default already. So once we have a area that we want to work with, we can then say create skin control. When we do so, we get a confirmation dialog here. The name, it has automatically suggested a name based upon where it found the soft mod. It found it near the elbow, so it's going to suggest the name skin1 elbow. By default, it's going to assume we're going to want to mirror it. We're going to want it locally oriented. These controllers are essentially going to have a joint for each control. That joint going to need a parent. It's suggested that the parent is going to be the nearest joint, in this case the elbow. There are a list of other joints you can choose. Now the order of these are going to be the distance from that soft mod. For us, we're going to keep that in elbow. There is an option here that says 50% joint as a parent, so that's kind of a useful option in some of the cases, like in this one in particular. That's going to insert a half rotating joint right at this elbow, also called a partial joint. And before we do so, I'll show you that you can manually create this at any given joint by go to the section called partial joints. And there's a help image that explains more what a partial joint is. It works on selection. You can select the elbow and hit partial joint. It will create a partial joint for the elbow. If nothing is selected, it will create it for all joints, which is not recommended. It's probably going to be overkill. Anyway, a partial joint is going to be a joint that rotates half of what the main joint is doing. So let's jump back to selecting our soft mode here and go to custom controls. Let's go ahead and create the skin control. And yes, I do want to use the partial joint, so it's going to have a 50% rotating joint as the parent. There we go. We now have a new joint. It has a controller, so it has the duality of being functional for a point to access automatically driving corrective deformation. It's also something the animator might want to grab and do some fine-tune animation with. Okay, we've done the first part. We've created the controller. It's now there. It's affecting a certain area. We can see that if we rotate the elbow, it's already 50% following the rotation, which is a good starting point. But what we're gonna want it to be pushing out as well. So we're now gonna create the driving system part of this corrective control. And the way to do it is we're gonna first go to the pose that we want to correct for. So we might want to do a exact number here just to keep the numbers clean. Let's say exactly 90 degrees. At that point, we want this to be pushed out, and we'll just move it into place. We want it to be pushed out, let's say about that much. We might even give it a little bit of rotation and even a little bit of scaling up to compensate. Let's say we want something like that. Then we're gonna go to the section called under pose subsection here. By the way, the reason why pose is not under the body subsection, that's because all these driving system corrective shapes also apply to the face, not just the body. That's why we have a separate section outside body face called pose. And then we'll open the driving systems option here. And we're gonna hit the button that says create driving system. However, we're gonna make sure we have the correct selection beforehand. If nothing is selected, we hit create driving system. That's gonna create a new controller that drives both of these into this position. That's not what we want. That's kind of driving system you see on the fingers, where you can easily select and curl the fingers. But we want a driving system that's automatically driven, and selected controller is what's going to be driving. So in this case, elbow controller selected, we hit the button that says create driving system. It has a list of every controller that is currently not in its default position. Now note that the first one on the list is the elbow itself that's detected, and we don't want that to be included. So basically, in the option of where it says create a new controller, we don't want to use the controller. Neither do we want to use an existing controller. We want to drive from the selected object. You can note that the first top line here that says the elbow is detected and will be driven, that gets automatically removed from the list because it's now the driver, it's not being driven. Angle rotations, this is covered in one of the frequently asked questions video. So will be a link on the screen right now that allows you to go in and learn more details what it means. The very short description is use angle rotations on 3 degrees of freedom joints. If not, leave it off. So for the elbow, we're gonna leave it off. We'll hit OK. And that's it. We can go ahead and test it. We can select the elbow, apply some rotation, and we can see that the elbow, our little skin controller here, is automatically being driven to move out. So that's how we can see that that works. The other thing we could do is we now right click on the edit button. You can see it appears in our list of driving system now, the rotate Z90. And if we want to make a change on how it's driven, we would simply just choose that. The elbow rotation, see 90, it will jump to that pose, has a little 30 frame animation so you can quickly see the result. Make sure you're on frame 30 if you are any changes, say you want to move it there instead. If you hit apply, you have now adjusted the effect. Okay, so let's just go ahead and create one more. We'll jump back in the body section. Another sophomore. We'll do one on the right on the inside of the elbow here. That's gonna help us to kind of push this area out a bit. Okay, so move that and create a skin control. Again, 50% of the joint is parent, and that's not gonna create a new 50% joint. There's already one there. It's just gonna make sure to use the one that was already created. And then we can go ahead and at this point, instead of going to the 90 degrees and again create a new driving system, we can just edit the one that's already existing. And we'll do that in the pose section. Go edit, elbow, rotate, say 90. Now that will hide that newly created controller. And the reason for that, we hit cancel. The reason for that is that by default, there's an option on here that says show only affected. And that's quite useful when you're editing driving systems, that you only see the controllers that are affected by that driving system. But in this case, we want to have a new controller to be added to that driving system. So in that case, we want to turn off that option to show only affected. And again, we'll edit this driving system. And now you can see it's not hidden the controller. We can then select it, move it. We can do what we want to. We can any kind of move, translate, scale, whatever works to make this kind of look a bit better. Deformation, maybe something like that. With that in the new position, we go ahead and hit apply. It will detect what changes has been made, and you can see this time when we rotate the elbow, both these controllers are now affected. So that's the principle to set up the corrective controls, which are automatically driven custom controllers. Now, instead of going through any more of them, because the principle is pretty much the same, I'm just going to go ahead and open the completed SAM character and show you here that, yes, this is similar to what we were setting up. There is actually, what I'll do here, I'll select the geometry and hit 3 because we want to do preview what we want the end result going to look like for the animators. They're probably going to want to work in this mode. And you can see that when we rotate this elbow, these custom controllers here are moving, rotating, scaling around to make sure we're getting a improved result on that deformation. There's one more button I'd like to show you here. In the driving system under here, there's one called Advanced. For this, I'm just going to move these shoulders out of the way a little bit. Let's grab the foot. Rotate, move the IK foot just so we get some rotation going on here, and the hip and the knee. I'll show you that there's a button here that can be kind of useful when you're working with corrective controls. It's called Create Blendable Preview Nodes, and it's under the driving system advanced option here. Hit the button that enables this slider, and essentially the slider allows you to quickly see the difference between not having any corrective controls and having corrective controls. Like in this case, as you can see, these are the default skinning issues that we typically get in skinning, and you can kind of blend in the effect to see the improved result. So yeah, basically this is just a function only for previewing with and without corrective controls. And keep in mind, it's creating nodes that don't need to be there and shouldn't be there in a final rig. So it's definitely recommended that as soon as you're finished with this preview, just to see that you're on the right track, that you delete them. There is a reminder for you in the outline, and if you were to look in the outline and you see this object in the top level outline called Driving System Blendable Preview, that's an indication that there's objects and nodes in the scene that don't really need to be there. So make sure to delete them after you're done with them. We can quickly look at just some more examples where you can see that you are getting a definite difference with and without these driving systems. I should say corrective controls, automatically driven corrective controls. So that's it for this time. We have been looking at how the demo character Sam has been rigged. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.